Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast, brought to you by Compliance Week and Aravo. My name is Dave Leafort with Compliance Week, and I will be your host. Today's webcast is titled Third Party Management 101, Mapping Your Program's Maturity. Before we hear from our presenters, let me review the agenda. We're scheduled to go today for 1 hour. After the presentation, we will have a question and answer session if there's any time remaining. Your questions will be kept confidential and anonymous, so please don't be shy. You can ask your question at any time using the Ask a Question function on the left-hand side of your screen, and I'll pose them to our guests at the end of the presentation. And after the Q&A, I'll wrap up the webcast. This webcast also offers CPE credit for all attendees. Please disable your pop-up blockers in order to access the exam. To obtain your credit, wait until the webcast is completely over and I sign off. At that point, the final exam will be presented automatically in a separate window. If you have trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving your CPE certificate, please send an email to webcasts@complianceweek.com. I'll repeat these instructions at the end of the webcast. A few other administrative details. At any time during the presentation, you can download the slides from the drop-down menu on the left-hand side of your screen. There, you will also find the feedback form for the webcast. We welcome your thoughts as we're always looking to improve your experience. If you want to increase the slide size, you can hit the View Slide Full Screen button at the top right corner of your screen. And lastly, a Help button is located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen for assistance. Now let's move on to the webcast. I'd like to welcome today's speakers. It's my pleasure to introduce first, Kimberly Allen. Kimberly brings more than a decade of executive leadership experience in the governance, risk, and compliance space, building brand recognition, thought leadership, and revenue-accelerating marketing programs. As part of her role at Aravo, Kimberly develops thought leadership content designed to help third-party risk professionals benchmark their programs, share best practices, elevate their conversations to the board, and build the business case for investment in the development of their programs. I'd also like to welcome David Rusher, who is responsible for Aravo's customer success programs, from pre-sales through to ongoing strategic support. He is also responsible for partner alliances, which has included pioneering work in building community and utilities TPRM applications for the defense, financial services, retail, and pharmaceutical industries. Welcome, Kimberly and David. It's great to have you with us. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dave. I really appreciate that. And also, I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us today. I imagine probably most of you, if not all of you, are working from your homes today like we are. We do hope that you and your loved ones are well, and we're extra appreciative of your time. And one of the things that really strikes me is we've got over 370 people on the call today, and it's just great that the community is still coming together. So again, thanks for joining us today. Now, a lot's really changed since we first planned this webinar with Compliance Week in January. It seems like an age ago now. I think most of us on this call will agree that the challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic and its consequences and impacts will only mean that topics like third-party risk and resilience, operational resilience, supply chain resilience, these are all going to be an even greater, focal points for governments, for the regulators, and for organizers as we look forward. So we're already having a lot of conversations about these areas now with many of you and your peers. But today we're really going to be focused on third-party risk management maturity. A question that we hear very often is, where do I start? Whether that's an organization that's just really starting to formalize a program, or from individuals who have just inherited a third-party risk management program to manage. So a really good place to start is understanding where you are. Understanding where you are and the journey that you have ahead really helps you to make the right decisions at the right time going forward. So maturity is also something that both Daves, I'm sure, and Dave Rusher and I are really passionate about. It's evident from the research that we've done, from the interactions that we have with those of you responsible for running programs, that understanding the maturity journey and also appreciating what's involved from a people, processes, governance, and technology perspective all really help companies achieve their objectives better. So our agenda's going to start a little bit with the why. Then we'll move through some of the research that we've conducted. It's hot off the press, some of these results. We've been working with Compliance Week on a benchmarking study. We'll then do a deep dive into each of these stages. And then we'll share some simple third-party risk management workflows. We thought this would be useful just to have a look and see how the workflows can exist, and then touch on how that these can be enhanced with automation. So what we hope by the end of today's webinar is, all this together will give you a framework for understanding where you are today in your maturity journey, and also give you a few pointers and indicators on what to be looking at for next. So why is understanding maturity so important? Well, as I mentioned, understanding where you are now really helps you plan for the journey ahead with your eyes wide open. You can start to set really realistic objectives, requirements, and timeframes as you go forward. It also helps with things like collaboration. There's multiple people in the team of third-party risk management, multiple stakeholders across the organization. And so by bringing these stakeholders together early in the conversation, it really helps to provide a framework for removing silos and planning and working together in this process. It also provides a framework for engaging senior management. One of the things that we'll touch on shortly is just the importance of, for instance, board engagement in this, so that you can choose the right, so that you can set the right expectations for senior management, and also sort of present the appropriate value points for gaining sponsorship and investment into your programs. It also helps you make the right technology decisions. So as you look at where you are today, you can make the right decisions in terms of the type of capabilities that you need today, but also be really cognizant of what you're going to be needing in the future. So this helps you extend your technology as your program matures. And finally there, we've got Accelerate. It can help you accelerate your maturity journey, but in a safe and measured way that really supports your success. You haven't set unrealistic expectations of sort of jumping from what might be a really highly immature stage in your program to an advanced stage sort of within weeks. So it gives you sort of a time frame and a framework to work to. But let's now just jump into the maturity model that we're using in today's conversation. So here's the maturity model that we're using today. You'll see there's 5 states there. We're going to, later in today's presentation, just dive into each of those states in a lot more detail. But this 5-stage model of maturity starts with ad hoc, moves through fragmented, defined, integrated, and agile stages. Now, this is a model that we built in conjunction with Michael Rasmussen. I'm sure many of you on today's call are familiar with Michael. He's an expert analyst in the space, often known as kind of the father of governance, risk and compliance, coining the GRC acronym. He was an analyst for Forrester before establishing his independent analyst firm, GRC 2020 in 2007. So he's a really good analyst to talk to and connect with, as you're building out your third-party programs as well. He's got a lot of experience in this space. But I think it's also fair to say that this isn't the only model that you'll see out there. There's other consultant firms like Deloitte and Protiviti who have similar models, but essentially the concept is the same. Third-party risk has a series of maturity stages that programs typically evolve through. So we'll dive into these stages a little bit more deeply shortly, And I'm also going to be, as we're doing this, asking Dave for a few more observations about the different ways that organizations are approaching these today. But before we jump in and do that, let's just take a quick look at what some of the research tells us about this maturity journey. So this is from research that we conducted with Compliance Week, hot off the press, 2020 research. It's part of a broader benchmarking survey that we have done with them. One of the questions was just to ask respondents, and we had over 200 respondents to the survey, to self-assess where their program maturity sat presently. So looking at these results, overall, 16% of respondents said that they're at this ad hoc stage of maturity. 29% said that they were at the fragmented stage. 24% reported that they are at the defined stage, and 26% reported that they are at the integrated stage. And there's just really only 5% that thought they were at the agile stage of maturity. We took these results and broke them down into respondents from financial services firms and from non-financial services firms. Sometimes we find that those in financial services, just because some of the regulatory attention that's applied on third-party risk, tend to be slightly more mature, and we kind of saw this in the results. There you can see that the financial services demographic tend to lean slightly towards the more mature end of the scale than those non-financial services organisations, which tended to be, marginally less mature, but there weren't significant differences there. Another important consideration that we like to ask the community about is board engagement. We've done a series of studies over the years. This is a third annual survey that we've conducted that's really found that the involvement of the board and how engaged they are tend to impact on program maturity. So this is an important factor to be successful. Programs typically need some kind of board and senior management sponsorship. So what's interesting here, what you can see here is those respondents who indicated that the boards were moderately or highly engaged in their program governance really had significantly more mature programs than those whose boards who had low engagement. We then asked our audience, how old are programs? It's another important consideration. You'd expect if you'd had a program in place for a longer period of time that it's going to be more mature than those that are perhaps just starting out. Most programs, as you can see there, 71% are only six years old or younger. Then when you take those organisations between 6 and 10 years in age, only 11% sort of fit in that particular grouping, and then 18% had programs that were 10 years old or more. It's not particularly surprising that programs tend to be sort of in this 0 to sort of 6 or 7 year range, particularly if you're in financial services. The OCC guidance on third-party risk, the OCC Bulletin 2013-29, was issued in 2013. That's 7 years ago. So that's when sort of the regulators in particular really indicated to their constituents that they were going to be applying a lot of focus on this. Not surprisingly, as we move on to maturity across various age groups, those whose programs have been in place longer tended to have the more mature programs. But what I think is quite interesting as you look at this is that you've got respondees whose programs are either not started or between 0 to 3 years in age, self-assessing that their programs are agile. That's 5% and 4% respectively. But look at those between 3 and 10 years. None at Agile. So I think what's happening here is it's like reality has set in. And as they're sort of building up an understanding of their programs, they're really beginning to understand how complex and multifaceted programs can be. But there's still a way to go. There's still a way to go here. What's worrying here is that, when you look at some of the programs that are more than 10 years old, that there's still a proportion of these that are sitting at the ad hoc stage, there's 8% there, and the fragmented stage, 13%. You don't want to be these guys. You don't want to have a program in place for that amount of time and not be at a more mature level than that. And I think, as we look at these results in aggregate, what they're really starting to tell us is that maturity takes both time and attention. So now let's just sort of dive into the stages themselves. I'm going to go a little bit deeper into these, talk a little bit about the characteristics of each stage and how to move to the next. But we'll just look at, again, the maturity model. And what I'll ask Dave to do is, Dave, you have conversations around maturity every day with a whole host of people in the industry, practitioners, consultants, customers, partners, the utility type groups that you work with. What are your immediate observations when it comes to this maturity framework?
Yeah, thanks, Kimberly, and hi, everybody. I think one of the interesting things that we often see in our conversations with all across the market, as Kimberly mentioned, we talk to analysts, we talk to prospective clients, and I'm constantly meeting with our own clients as well. And I'd say the one observation that I have is similar to a comment that Kimberly made on that previous slide, in that companies that are just getting started in their third-party risk management journey are often either assessing themselves as Agile or expressing their desire to become Agile in third-party risk management. And I would say in most of the engagements that we have with new clients in terms of looking for solutions or evaluating vendors or partners to help them with their programs, most of those requests that we see, I would characterize as indicative of Agile-oriented requirements. We don't see companies coming to us with a set of requirements, for instance, that are aligned with them being at an ad hoc or a fragmented stage. So everybody's coming to us with the expectation eventually that they're going to get to this Agile stage. They've got all kinds of requirements around it. But the idea there is that in order for them to achieve it, it's not practical in most cases to assume that if you are just getting started and you are really more in an ad hoc fashion, you're just getting going on your journey, it's fine to have aspirations of becoming Agile, but recognizing that it is going to be a phased journey and that you're going to have to take some steps along the way in order to achieve that. So I think that's the most important thing I would say is, if any of you are out there and you're just getting started, or you have already just gotten started with your third-party risk management program, I'd say it's totally fine to maintain a vision towards becoming integrated or Agile, but with a practical expectation of that journey and what's going to be required. Obviously, technology can play a part of it, but it's not often the critical success factor there. There's a lot of other organizational requirements around your people and your processes that are going to support that journey, either eventually or in an accelerated fashion, depending on how you choose to move forward there. So, Kimberly, I think that's the primary thing I'd like to say before we dive into each of the detailed areas.
Thanks, Dave. And I think they're great observations. And ad hoc, of course, is a good place to start this conversation. And Dave alluded to this. Third-party risk management programs are dependent on a number of interconnected elements. So there's the people, the processes, the technology enablement, and the governance that are involved. I'm not going to go through all the bullet points on these slides. You'll have them. I'm just going to sort of talk about them in context. So organizations, at the ad hoc stage are really challenged when it comes to really properly managing third-party risk. They don't have anyone focused on third-party risk management. Few, if any, resources are allocated to third-party governance at this stage. Processes at this stage tend to be pretty ad hoc and reactive. There's no consistency in terms of what's being done. So someone, may do attestations or assessments in the form of a few questions that were sent to a third party via email and an Excel sheet because someone in the compliance department told them to. And there's no true review and assessment or process or governance, associated with that. Approaches at this stage are also, they're really siloed. You certainly wouldn't find at the ad hoc stage a single inventory of all the third parties. There's no structured way at this stage of assessing the inherent risk of the third party at the entity level, let alone the engagement or the contract level, which we'll touch on a little bit later as we mature in our journey. At this stage, there doesn't tend to be any dedicated technology in place, with organisations at this stage are typically relying on spreadsheets and email. Now, that might be okay if you've got, say, half a dozen or a dozen third parties, but most companies are working with a lot more third parties and suppliers than that. I think the average number of our customers in terms of the number of third parties they have is around 55,000. I know Dave will have a bit the exact figure, but I think it sits at around that stage. So, companies today, particularly the multinational, international companies, are working with hundreds, thousands, and in some cases over 1 million third parties. And at this stage, there's no clear governance, there's no documented processes or procedures at this stage. You don't really find senior management engagement or board engagement or sponsorship at this stage, which generally means there's not really any money for this. There's no budget, nothing's been allocated to this. At this stage, you're finding things are very document-centric, relying on contract language. There's no due diligence, for instance, before starting relationships in most instances. And again, I've touched on this, there's no real single inventory of third parties at this stage. As we noted, 16% of respondents said that they're at this stage, but what is slightly scary here is that 8% of respondents with programs in place for more than 10 years said that they're at this stage. Don't be that guy. You want to be able to mature and continue on your journey. So Dave, just over to you. What are some of the observations about the stage, and what kind of advice would you give someone who wants to move forward?
Yeah, I think probably the way I would characterize this stage and what you need to be focused on in this stage, it's a little bit about recognizing you're there and taking inventory of the current state of affairs and getting organized. So if you find yourself in the position of, kind of conducting technology due diligence or RFPs, it's probably a bit early for that, to be honest. In my opinion, if you're here, it's okay, but it's all about getting yourselves organized, taking an inventory, of the information that you do currently have and where is it stored, right? It may not be where you want it. It may not be in a format that's easily accessible or distributed, but at least you're developing that inventory and you've got an idea about what you're going to need to be considering in terms of centralizing it or automating it. So I'd say that's really kind of the focus there. And I would say folks that, end up, to that 8% there, they've been at this for a decade or more. A lot of the reasons that they can't seem to get past this stage or maybe even a fragmented stage, it's going to have a lot more to do with the ability to collaborate with stakeholders across various different departments, and it is going to have an awful lot to do with senior management buy-in to the approach, to the program, and to the investments that are going to need to be made. I would say in most cases, if you're stuck in this stage, it's not necessarily a technology problem that you're running into. It's probably a sponsorship or a focus on what it is you're trying to do. It could very well be that your expectations are misset, but I'd say it's more about collaboration and sponsorship internally.
That's great. Thanks, Dave. Which takes us to the next stage, which is the fragmented stage. Now, by the time you get to the fragmented stage, what you're tending to find here is that different functions are starting to implement their own processes and tools to really solve for their own departments or domains. So, for instance, you might have your IT security sort of applying processes and technologies for information security and what they need to do there, whereas compliance may be using an entirely different process on the other side of the business for ABAC risk and looking at that separately. So processes here are still fairly tactical and siloed. But there's some good practices that are beginning to emerge. At this stage, you might have some, basic segmentation sort of based on criticality or materiality of your third parties and suppliers. And you might have some sort of light risk scoring in terms of being able to identify who are your low risk, medium risk, and high risk suppliers in pockets at this stage. But at this stage, you're still not sort of using, some of the more advanced methodologies in third-party risk. It's unlikely that you've got any ongoing monitoring in place at this stage. It still tends to be a little bit of a one-and-done deal. And you're still really, at this stage, struggling to get your house in order with your third parties. So you're not even sort of looking towards what you might be needing to consider in terms of your fourth parties and beyond that. So we noted that 29 respondents said that they are at this stage, and 13% of respondents who have had programs in place for more than 10 years said that they're at this stage as well. So again, Dave, maybe you could just sort of add your observations about this stage and, what advice you'd be giving companies to move to this next stage, which will be defined.
Sure, I would say this is generally where companies tend to get engaged with Aravo is once they've gotten themselves to this stage. And I would also say that'll carry forward into the defined stage as we look at that in a moment. But I think at this stage, really what you're trying to do is focus on the higher priority or the more impactful risk areas that you may have within an organization. Those could be cybersecurity threats or information security threats that are particular to a subset of your third-party ecosystem, your cloud hosting providers, your IT outsourcing providers, and the like. And there are a lot of great solutions out there in the market. There are a lot of great focused kind of point solutions that can help you get those relationships centralized, get a handle on some of those types of things. But really, if you're fragmented, at least you can take an approach to getting one particular high priority silo of risk under control with a group of stakeholders. And I would say that's a really good step. It may be across multiple risk domains, and it might even be different approaches across different risk domains. But I would say developing some maturity around just general risk management in those domains is important here. What you start to do at this stage is really determine if your organization does tend to have risks that are multifaceted. Are the relationships that you have in the market really around kind of technology risks? Like I said, cloud hosting providers, third-party outsourcers, IT hosting partners, or are they more broad to your organization? Are you also conducting business through intermediaries in foreign countries other than which your organization are based? That's obviously a different or additional risk factor that would tend to be around kind of anti-bribery, anti-corruption, or responsible sourcing and sustainable procurement, et cetera. And so I think that's really what's going to help you determine how you approach and when you move forward is once you've kind of gotten one part of your house in order and you're ready to start expanding those good practices. Sometimes it will be supported through technology, but those good practices that you've developed as a company around multiple risk domains, that's when I think you can start to progress out of the fragmented stage into more of a defined stage to start to bring those together in a more consistent fashion.
Super, which really brings us to the defined stage. So as organizations sort of reach this defined stage, they've really starting to get established programs in place. They've got the right people, processes, technology, and governance beginning to take shape in their program. Now, there's still some silos that might exist at this stage, but typically there's consistent approaches to onboarding, inherent risk assessments, being conducted across multiple risk domains, be that ABAC, anti-bribery, anti-corruption, compliance, information security questions. You might have data privacy questions, depending on the product and service that your third party delivers. Issue management and remediation is probably something that organizations are typically beginning to introduce in more rigor at this point in time. And the program at this stage is generally starting to look towards this life cycle management from the very sort of time that you might be looking at the intake of new third parties through into the inherent risk assessment process, through due diligence, enhanced due diligence, onboarding, transactional enablement, moving through into this continuous and ongoing monitoring, and also thinking about sort of termination and offboarding, maybe considerations that organizations are also looking for as this takes shape. Organizations at this stage are also typically being supported by some kind of workflow enablement technology. This could be GRC systems, sometimes ERP systems, or best-of-breed third-party risk management specialist solutions. Also at this stage, organizations might be also taking advantage of various risk intelligence data, such as security scorecard or BitSight for cyber health and cyber ratings, Refinitiv for screening and ABAC compliance, rapid ratings for financial health, and so on. Now, this data might not be fully integrated into their workflow technology at this point in time for validation and continuous monitoring, but that risk intelligence will likely be, started to be applied in programs. What we also hear a lot at this stage is that organizations don't necessarily just want to be able to assess the risk at the entity or vendor level, but also really look deeper into the engagement or the project level. So they want to know not only if their vendor is risky, but also if they're risky for the actual contract or engagement that they're involved in. Now, just to give you an example of this, say I was a life sciences company and I was assessing my vendors, and a leading multinational technology company might be fine for a project or an engagement that I want them to work on involving outsourcing a data center, because that's what they do. I know they've got all the right security protocols. That's their lifeblood. But it's going to be a lot more of a risky proposition. So if I was going to be looking at them for, say, outsourcing clinical testing, that's not what they do. It introduces a lot more risk into the relationship. Same third-party vendor, but different engagements or projects. Importantly, at this stage as well, we see organizations are really beginning to build up consistent data, and this is really important. Once you start to get some of that consistent data, you've got a basis in terms of program improvement decisions that you can work with. So at this stage, we're seeing 24%, of organizations typically say they're at the defined stage, and 23% of respondents that have had programs in place for over 10 years find themselves at this stage. But Dave, be interested in your observations about this stage.
Yeah, I think you defined kind of what's going on in the stage really well. You've moved into a posture at this point where you are probably leveraging technology to a pretty advanced extent in support of your third-party risk management activities. So you've got some good technology, you've developed some good process, and you're starting to gain stakeholder awareness and participation. And that's all. What I would say that is a characteristic of this stage is that last bullet point there. It's that the organization is starting to really develop good visibility into what third-party risk management means, and they're gaining transparency into the state, risk, or the overall relationship that you have throughout your third-party ecosystems. And that's really important, because that whole stakeholder visibility and sponsorship will be critical to get into the next stage. Having a good program definition in place, having some good experience in managing some of these processes for a few years will be critical as you try to advance into an integrated stage. You're going to need people kind of recognizing the value and the importance of the program and playing along with according to the same playbook or strategy, as well as having developed some good relationships between one another and the organization and their departments to facilitate that integrated set of processes. So to me, at this stage, it's a good one, because it's where people's eyes are truly being opened to the risk that may exist or the state of the relationships that they've developed. And it then enables them to make good decisions about whether they're ready to move forward. And it's kind of the first point to me in the maturity cycle where you've got enough experience and enough information to dictate how far up the maturity chain your organization will be prepared to go or even needs to go. And that's that information and the ability to make those more informed decisions is absolutely critical. So I'd say to me, there's a reason it's in the middle of the maturity chain. It really is kind of the crucible in terms of, do you have more work to do, and are you here, or are you prepared to kind of tip the scale and move on into an integrated or even an agile state of maturity?
Fabulous. And I imagine that as we move into the integrated stage, things like flexible integration frameworks are about to become increasingly important, be that with technology, other technology in your business, technology, architecture, as well as data integration as well. So moving on to the integrated. Yeah, sorry, Dave.
No, just real quick on that, it's a good segue. I think a lot of times what we see with our clients is they will get started, at least in their relationship with Aravo, they'll get started in a specific risk domain or maybe a few risk domains like anti-bribery, data privacy, and information security. Those tend to be the three most common. And they can do that across the various different stakeholders that are responsible for those risk domains. Getting a handle on it, establishing a common risk register, starting to develop their control framework in terms of how to triage and mitigate risk and take action against it. And at the defined level, that's a really good thing to see. If you've got those three risk domains happening together in a system, that's fantastic. As you then start to progress into an integrated state, there's a totally different set of stakeholders that tend to become critical at that stage. And as Kimberly mentioned it, and we'll go through it here, it's a lot more of your technology stakeholders within the business. It tends to bridge now into a lot of the procurement and sourcing platforms that you will already have, that highly likely that they've been in place for a lot longer than your third-party risk management program. Different group of stakeholders who I would argue have probably been involved through your ad hoc and fragmented and defined stage, at least in terms of a consultant or a trusted guide. But at the point that you progress into the integrated stage is when their contributions and their resources are really going to become critical. So we'll start off with that, Kimberly, and go from there.
Yeah, no, thanks, Dave. I think, what we're seeing at the integrated stage, as Dave's alluded to, is you're seeing a really joined up approach across the enterprise, across the functions, and bringing in new functions as well into the process, across data and across your technology infrastructure. And then you're also sort of really starting to use more mature processes in your program. So by this stage, organizations will have some type of ongoing or continuous monitoring in place. They'll have a view of their fourth parties generally at this stage. And they'll also be leveraging third-party risk intelligence content to support automated business processes and enhanced decision-making within the platform. So at this stage, you can start to see typically that organizations will have brought some of those risk intelligence providers that are starting to fuel some of the workflows and decision-making capabilities within the workflow technology as well. Organizations at this stage, and I think this is probably going to become a little bit more important on the back of everything as well, might be starting to really think about third-party performance at this stage, and that has sort of implications for resilience as well. So they might be looking at this stage at integrating some qualitative and quantitative performance measures into the program. So by the integrated stage, you're really sort of imagining sort of, well, what's next? How do we build on this, and how do we become more agile, and how do we identify sort of, risk and non-performance and so forth as well in the program. Moving to the next slide. At this stage, 26% of organizations overall stated that they're at the integrated stage. And you can see now we're seeing those numbers go up. There's 41% of organizations that have had programs in place for 10 years or more who are at this integrated stage. But what that tells us is it takes a while to get here. So, this is after 10 years of, managing programs and evolving in a phased way to become integrated in terms of their approach. So, Dave, do you have any observations about the integrated stage before we move on to the agile?
Yeah, I would say it's interesting when you look at fully a quarter of organizations consider themselves to be in this stage, and when you look at the life cycle of those organizations that say they've been at this for a decade or more, and it's 41%. I mean, that's far and away the largest percentage of the respondents claimed that, with 10 years or more, they're still in that stage. It's not surprising. These are where this stage is challenging. You're really trying to navigate some very different groups within your organization. Kimberly made a really good point. You've got your risk management functions at this stage fairly well integrated with one another. That's a good characterization. You've got your information security experts operating in conjunction with your data privacy experts, your anti-bribery, anti-corruption experts, your business continuity, etc. Your risk functions are very well integrated at this stage and working together. But you start to now examine that information and those processes that you've standardized to maybe improve performance. So you've got a different group of folks within your organization typically that are responsible for monitoring the contractual performance of those relationships, the contextual or the qualitative aspects of those relationships. Do you work well together? Are you culturally aligned? Are these partners that you feel comfortable working with? It's a lot more of that qualitative aspect of these relationships that influence that performance notion. Obviously, there's quantitative metrics as well, but there are multiple different groups, I would say, that you start to expand into. We talked earlier also about the need to become more tightly integrated with your procurement and sourcing organizations, and a lot of that have to do with that qualitative aspect. You do your good job as you can in managing risk and triaging risk, but once you've got a relationship in place, there's likely other folks within your business who are responsible for leveraging that relationship, getting the most out of it, making good decisions about how to extend the relationship, or in some cases, how to terminate the relationship. And so it's not surprising, as I mentioned, that this is the highest percentage of organizations with really long-standing programs. They're still here. It takes a lot of work to get all of those parts and pieces in place. So I would say it's a good aspirational area to get to here. It does take a lot of time, I would say, to get to and through this. And so at this point, though, you are starting to make decisions about how much further up the chain do you really want to go, or do you even need to go? I mean, a lot of organizations, once they achieve this integrated state, that may be good enough. we'll look at a little bit about what's going to characterize the agile state in a moment. But this stage is a good place to get to for organizations, and a lot of times it's good enough, and it's functioning well, and they don't even have a need or a justification for doing anything more in their programs. So, and I'm seeing some questions come across that. We'll get into it a little bit later in terms of how far up the chain is it practical for any organization to get into. I'd say this integrated stage is the one that I end up spending the majority of time with our clients on. They tend to be the larger organizations. They tend to be pretty mature in and of themselves. They tend to have been working with us for quite a long time. So there's a lot of work that goes into this stage, and a lot of that, it helps you make the decisions as to whether you have a need or a justification to get more advanced in your journey.
Great, which sort of takes us to the agile stage. And I guess agile isn't so much as a stage of being. And the key here is to be able to stay in it. So here at the agile stage, all your people, your processes, and your governance are all really optimized, and technology is enabling all that. At this stage, you've got a 360-degree of risk. You've got really mature, processes that you're using within your organization. You've got a view not of just your third parties, but their subcontractors, your fourth parties, fifth parties, and beyond. If required. Here, you're looking at the performance management and thinking about your third parties and managing them and interacting with them in a much more strategic way, particularly those that are your more sort of critical strategic third parties. At this stage, there's not many people at this stage, not many organizations at this stage. Only 5% of respondents reported that they're at this stage. And as we alluded to earlier, there were some participants who were just starting out their programs or between 1 and 3 years in terms of having programs in place who identified themselves as agile. Maybe that was a little bit of a misidentification at that stage. So I think that figure is probably inflated a little bit in terms of where the reality actually stands. However, organizations that had had their programs in place for 10 years and more, 15% of them reported themselves at this stage. And I think that's a lot more, reflective in terms of this does take time, and it does take, dedicated attention to becoming the agile organization, third-party risk management program that they were seeking. So, Dave, what are some of your observations about this stage, and what do companies need to do to stay in it?
Yeah, that sounds great, Kimberly. Just a quick heads up, we've got about 10 minutes left. So just wanted you to know that if you hadn't seen it. What I'll say about Agile is whether you get here and whether you stay here have a lot to do with the rate of change in your business. And so for organizations, depending on the scope and the risks that you've been looking at up to the integrated stage, and depending on the industry in which your organization operates, are going to dictate to a high extent whether you need to move yourself into Agile. If you're an organization that has a lot of M&A, you buy a lot of companies, you acquire a lot of different types of organizations, then getting to an Agile state with respect to your third-party risk management program is going to be important because you're going to need a mechanism to incorporate additional functions, companies, resources, processes into your business. If you're an organization who has regulatory mandate for what you need to do, if you're a financial services firm, we talk about those folks a lot, but also pharmaceutical firms have a high degree of regulatory mandate within their businesses. If you fall into that category, then being in an Agile state is important because you will have developed the processes, the technology, and the personnel to accommodate that regulatory mandated change, more easily without as dramatic impact to your company. And I would say those tend to be, the elements that get you into a state of agility and keep you there are those needs. You will have discovered those needs. You will have purchased companies over the first decade of your journey, as an example. You will have had to inherit whatever systems and processes they've had. You will have learned the value of the ability to accommodate those things in an accelerated fashion. You're going to have seen regulatory change. So by this point, you'll know how much and to what degree your particular business or industry are impacted by those things that are, in a lot of cases, outside of your control, but you need the ability to react and manage them effectively. And that's, I think, the cornerstone for staying agile. So high degree of mergers and acquisitions or organizational evolution, lots of regulatory mandate and change. As you guys all know, that something's changing and being added to or extended every year from a regulatory perspective, and the more of that impacts your business, the more it's going to make sense for you to consider getting into an agile state.
Great. So I think, we've gone through a lot of the stages over the course of the presentation today. Just before we touch on a couple of the workflows, and we'll go through this quickly, it'd be really good to sort of understand among the audience on today's call, and if Nicole, you could trigger the survey here, what stage do you think your own program maturity falls under? Ad hoc, fragmented, defined, integrated, or are you some of the few at this agile stage? So the results coming through from the audience, I hope you can all see these. We're sitting at around 16% for ad hoc, around the 28, 29% for fragmented, about 27% for defined, 19, 20% are integrated, and close to 9% are agile. So quite reflective of the results of the survey which we presented earlier. But it's great to share that, and thanks for sharing that with us. What we thought would be next, we do have a tool for this just before we go into the workflows. If you want to calculate your maturity, we do have an online calculator for this, which just gives you some useful outputs in terms of a document that you might want to use internally in your own conversations to help strike up conversations in terms of, well, what's next for us. But moving on to why is a clearer path to maturity, why is this required from a technology decision point of view, Dave?
Yeah, I would just say, these programs, I've been blown away. I mean, I've been in the enterprise software space for 26 years, and I have to say that third-party risk management at scale is probably one of the more complex challenges that I've been asked to solve for over that 26-year career. The investments are high, both on the technology side, but also organizationally with people and process. So this clear path to maturity is really going to help you all determine and get a clear picture for the degree of that investment, how much you're going to be willing to make, how much is going to be justified. And I would just say what we try to do with all of these, they're typical questions, and I would just say that what you want to do is avoid some of these outcomes. So in whether it's technology in terms of the solution or whether it's a process for the solution, you want to find things that are going to be flexible over time, that can be extended over time and grow with you. We see a lot of times people going into this with a misset expectation about that degree of investment or about that, without a good picture for that 5-stage journey, as an example, and they end up making investments at the ad hoc or fragmented stages of their journey and assuming that that's going to be all they would ever need, or that that's characteristic of what third-party risk management would need to become at scale. And if you make those decisions, you may end up locked into them, I guess I could say. It would make it very difficult to progress into a defined or integrated stage if you make the wrong kinds of decisions. So just having a full picture, like we said, of the maturity, whether you're using the model that we've discussed here, or whether you're looking at some of the other models, and you should, by the way, you should look at the way that Deloitte characterizes it or Protiviti characterizes it. They'll all have very similar kind of categories and expectations, but having that better picture is going to help you all, just gain clarity in terms of what you and your organizations need to be prepared to do. Again,
Great. The other thing that we thought
if you are in the ad hoc, Kimberly, if you are in the ad hoc or fragmented, approaching the market with a due diligence or an RFP that's characteristic of Agile, and an expectation that you're going to jump from ad hoc or fragmented to Agile or even integrated in a single phase, that's going to be very dangerous. That would be a very dangerous decision or assumption to make. So I would say we see a lot of challenge. We see a lot of organizations that, for any number of reasons, made that assumption, and that's where they run into problems.
Cool. We also thought, thanks, Dave. We thought it would also be just useful for the audience today just to share some very simple third-party management workflows, the type of things that you might be starting out with. So I don't know if, Dave, you just want to reflect on this, and we've got another one which is a little bit more complex, and they can get very complex, but simple is a really good place to start. And then just before we close, we'll just show how automation can support this, because you can have these processes without technology automation, but certainly the automation can help you in terms of enabling them.
Yeah, I would just say, to that point there, you will need these types of diagrams or documentation as you're moving, getting through ad hoc. That's a part of getting your inventory in place and getting yourselves organized. Moving into the fragmented stage, picking one of the lanes from an audience perspective. Either you're designing a solution that is of good use to risk experts, or you're designing a solution that's primarily pointed at business relationship managers, just for a couple of roles. Those become important. So these types of charts are going to be helpful to guide you and get yourself organized. Moving ahead, if you move to just the ability in this example is more indicative of an integrated state where you've got all your multiple risk domains in place. You've managed to integrate from a supplier enablement and onboarding with your procurement and sourcing systems. So these are all going to evolve over time. And again, they should evolve in parallel with whatever technology decisions you're making. I would also say you're not going to find a single solution from any vendor in the market that is going to be your one silver bullet across all these stages. It's going to be a collection of best practice tools and technologies and processes. So you've got to evolve that as you move forward. What I will tell you is that the benefit you really want to get to from a technology perspective is establishing a clear view into the veracity of your program, centralizing it and having visibility into it in this particular type of a view, where you've got who did what, when, where, why, at what point. That's going to be really critical. If in the case that there is an adverse event that occurs and does require investigation or an analysis of findings, having all of the technology in place that have centralized this across all these processes will be invaluable as you're defending or trying to identify what went wrong and how you might want to react to it. So it can drastically reduce the costs associated with discovery, as an example, if it were to be a legal investigation of some kind. Privileging a system privileging a system where all of your information lives, rather than having to privilege all of your documents, spreadsheets, emails, SharePoints, file folders throughout your organization, can be a much more effective and a lot less of a painful process.
Thanks, Dave. And we're right on the hour now, so we'll just close out. And I know there's some questions come through, so what we'll resolve to do is we'll put up a blog post answering some of these questions and have the link sent out to you. But, some of the keys to success I think we've heard over the course of today is sort of understand where you are and start simple. Don't try and boil the ocean. When you're sitting at this ad hoc or fragmented stage, take a considered view of sort of what makes sense in terms of what we do next and what do I need in terms of the people, the processes and the governance and the technology enablement to support that. We find and we recommend organizations to really stand something up, quickly. You don't have to have everything at this agile stage to begin with. Stand up a system, that has some workflow automation for you, business process automation that you can bring and aggregate your data together. And then as you gain a better understanding of where you are, then it gives you the intelligence that you need and that data that you need to really to begin to extend your program and start to look at other things there. And also don't reinvent the wheel. A lot of organizations think that, their way is the only way of doing it, but when you look in aggregate, a lot of the processes, across organizations, are very similar, and where you can standardize, that makes sense as well. So, Dave, do you have any sort of parting tips to the audience?
No, I think you did a great job, Kimberly, of structuring the conversation. So I certainly appreciate that, and I appreciate everybody for joining. And as Kimberly mentioned, we're taking a look at the questions, and we'll figure out the mechanism to get you the responses to those published. So thanks, Kimberly. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Dave and Dave.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us, everyone, and thank you for Kimberly and David for that great content and that great presentation. If you would like a copy of the slides that were just presented, you can download it from the drop-down menu on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. I'd like to give special thanks to Aravo for making this webcast possible. And once again, to obtain your CPE credit for this presentation, please disable your pop-up blockers in order to access the final exam. The webcast will close automatically and the exam will be presented in a separate window. If you have trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving your CPE certificate, please send an email to webcasts@complianceweek.com. And lastly, this webcast has been recorded and will be available later today to Compliance Week members on our website under the webcast tab. This concludes today's webcast. Thank you again for joining us, and goodbye.